Few efforts in human history compare to the Herculean effort by NASA to send humans to the moon. The Apollo missions stand as an achievement unlike any other yet, but it was not an achievement of just a few people, but rather an estimated 400,000 working on all aspects of the missions. The stories of the astronauts and the principal figures of Apollo have been well told, as they should be, but what of the other several 100,000 people that worked on the missions? My guest today set out to find some of those people and record their recollections of their time working to send humans to the moon.
Welcome to Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. In today's episode, John is joined by Nancy Atkinson. Nancy is a science journalist and author with a passion for telling stories of people involved in space exploration and astronomy. She writes for Universe Today and Ad Astra. Her latest book, 8 Years to the Moon, The History of the Apollo Missions, shares the untold story of engineers and scientists who helped make the Apollo program so successful, despite the daunting odds against it. Her first book, Incredible Stories from Space, a behind-the-scenes look at the missions changing our view of the cosmos, tells the stories of 37 scientists and engineers that work on several current NASA robotic missions to explore the solar system and beyond.
Nancy Atkinson, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me on. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Now, Nancy, you wrote a really neat book, 8 Years to the Moon, The History of the Apollo Missions, but it was a different kind of book than I've ever read on the Apollo missions, meaning you interviewed the people that other people did not. You went and found the engineers and the people that worked on this, on the many, many different parts of Apollo that made it come together. How did you find all these people, and what was that like talking to them?
Well, it was actually kind of a challenge to find people, but yeah, I knew that I had to do something different with my book because there are already dozens of books out about the Apollo program, and especially this time around the 50th anniversary of the missions, there's lots of books that have been coming out. So I decided to do what I love most, which is talking to people who work behind the scenes and normally don't receive any recognition or accolades for their works. Most previous books focus on the astronauts, NASA leaders, politicians maybe. I wanted to talk to the people who helped design and build the spacecraft and all the various parts and components that were needed to accomplish all those incredible things that had never been done before. And I wanted to share kind of the untold stories of the ordinary yet everyday people who worked on such an historic part of our country's history. Yeah, it was a challenge to find these people because they're, this all happened 50 years ago. So they're all in their 70s, 80s. One gentleman I talked to is in his 90s. So they're all retired. And my usual call to the NASA media relations people, they said, well, we can't really help you because they're all retired. But they did direct me to a group of retirees called the NASA Alumni League, and that group was incredibly helpful in putting me in touch with people who work behind the scenes. And one person in particular I have to thank, especially his name is Norman Chaffee. He was a chemical engineer for NASA, and he said, well, could you come down to Houston? And I live in Minnesota. So I went down there, and Norm reserved a room at a conference center, and he set up 2 full days of back-to-back interviews. And so I just sat in that room, and people came in and told me their stories. It was absolutely amazing. They not only told me their stories, they brought in photos of themselves at work or pictures of the components they worked on or papers that detailed the systems that they worked on or the work that they did. So the book includes a lot of personal photos from the people I interviewed, as well as stories that you won't find anywhere else.
Now, if you had to pick a story that struck you the most, what was your favorite?
There are a few that stand out. I feel really fortunate to be able to tell the stories of two of the very few women engineers at NASA during those days. They were kind of, hidden figures who worked behind the scenes. One of them was named Dottie Lee, and she worked on designing the heat shield, the part that provides protection for the spacecraft when it's re-entering Earth's atmosphere. Another woman is Kathy Osgood, who is a member of the team that figured out how to do rendezvous in space, which is figuring out how two spacecraft can meet up and come together in space, which really was a huge challenge for NASA. It was kind of an unknown quantity back in the early 60s, so they had to figure all these out. But I think maybe my most enjoyable interview was another really unique person. He's one of the few African American engineers in the 1960s, and he didn't work for NASA, but he worked at Honeywell in Minneapolis. And his name is Earl Kyle. And he worked on some of the components for steering and navigating the spacecraft. And of course, during the run-up to Apollo, in the mid-1960s, our country had a lot of things going on besides just Apollo. There were racial tensions, Vietnam War was going on, there was all sorts of social equity issues. And so Earl was kind of right in the middle of all of that because his father was a very active person in the African American community, and then his mother was white. So he had a very unique childhood, especially for those times in the 1950s and 1960s. And so he has a really, really unique and touching story. But most of the people were either engineers or scientists who were, again, figuring out all those things that had never been done before. And they really had some unique challenges and hurdles to overcome. I think just kind of it was a perfect storm of the technology that was just becoming available. Things like, integrated circuits for computers that made it possible for computers to be small enough, instead of the size of rooms that they were back then, they could be made small enough to fit inside of a spacecraft, and they could be fast enough to do real-time computing for a spacecraft that's traveling at 25,000 miles per hour. And then it was the perfect storm of the political climate of those days, the Cold War. It just really, people were just kind of caught up in this space race, and they just felt this was a kind of a national priority.
Now, one thing that struck me when reading the book was just the sheer amount of diversity of people that were needed to make this work. And I remember one particular account of textile weavers that were brought in to essentially hardwire the programming in some of the instrumentation and actually using skills taken from weaving. How did you find out about that kind of stuff?
Well, I actually went out to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, where the Apollo guidance computer was conceived of and built. And they showed me all these various, I got to see an actual Apollo guidance computer and talk to some of the people who worked back in the 1960s on this. And the hard wiring of these computer components, they were just, the whole concept of it is almost mind-boggling. Computers are ones and zeros, and so they had these little tiny wires running in and out of these, there were little round magnetic cores, they called them, very tiny. And if the wire went through the magnetic core, it was a 1. If it went around it, it was a 0. So that was how they programmed the computers. And so to create these very complicated weaving patterns, they, called on the weaving industry out on the East Coast and hired all these women who were very adept at weaving and following instructions. And so they followed these very detailed instructions and would sit across from each other. Two people would sit across from each other, and they would make sure that each of them was weaving them the right way. And it's so amazing and kind of just mind-boggling how they figured out how to do that in the first place, and then all of the mechanics that they figured out to make it work.
It just goes to show you how different it was and how cutting edge it was at that time, because a lot of this stuff had nothing like it had ever been done before. But, I mean, look at the task, going to the moon in 1969. Now, about the political climate at the time, which was certainly contentious, what about the political will? Now, John F. Kennedy gave his famous speech, put a man on the moon within X amount of time and bring him safely back to Earth. But there was an accident, a fatal accident within the Apollo missions that sometimes gets overlooked in comparison to the space shuttle accidents and things like that. Did that affect the political will at the time to get this done, or was it trudge ahead no matter what?
There's two answers to that question. One is that, after the Apollo 1 fire, which killed 3 astronauts, and it was a fire that took place during a test of the spacecraft while it was on the launch pad. They weren't planning to launch or anything. There was no fuel in the tanks or anything, so it was considered a non-hazardous test. But a fire broke out inside of the spacecraft, and there was a 100% oxygen environment inside of the spacecraft. And one tiny little spark soon led to an inferno, which quickly and tragically killed the astronauts. On the one hand, there were the people who said, "Okay, space flight and all this, attempts to fly in space is just too dangerous. Let's get it stopped. It's expensive. Why should we have the loss of life in the attempt to conquer space?" But all of the people that I interviewed for the book, they, I think, were even more resolved to get to the moon, both for in memory of the astronauts who lost their lives, but also they wanted to make things right. Each of the people who worked on Apollo, and there were 400,000 people, the estimate is, that worked on the Apollo program across the country and around the world. They each kind of took it upon themselves to say, if this thing fails, it's not going to be because of me. I'm going to do whatever it takes to make this happen. These people were completely and totally committed to getting to the moon. They worked incredibly long hours, 6 to 7 days a week, working 60 to 70 hours a week was not uncommon. And it wasn't just for a short period of time. This was for 8 years leading up to the Apollo program. And so when it came to moving forward from the Apollo 1 fire, their resolve was even more pronounced. It was my impression from talking to them in making sure that they could follow through with the kind of audacious challenge that President Kennedy put forth of going to the moon and returning safely.
Another thing about Apollo is that once we got it going and we had multiple missions to the moon, it was somewhat abruptly ended in favor of the shuttle program. Do you think that we should have continued with Apollo?
One of the reasons I think Apollo was ended early was a safety reason. We had Apollo 13 where there was the accident during the flight where there was an explosion of an oxygen tank. And that was a very close call. And after that mission, then we had Apollo 14, 15, 16, and 17, which were all successful. I think a lot of politicians and maybe even higher ups at NASA thought, hey, we've got a good string going here. Let's not jinx it by trying to do too much. And the public's interest in Apollo had begun to wane. All of the missions, the broadcasts from the moon, they would be on during the daytime and would preempt people's favorite television shows, and people would call in to complain, which it's kind of hard to imagine. But there were a lot of things pointing to ending the Apollo program early. And the other part was, yes, the space shuttle program was starting to be thought of and conceived of. In fact, I tell a story in the book of Dottie Lee, who the night that Apollo 11 returned from the moon, she was working late because she was working on the space shuttle program. So her duties had shifted, and I think A lot of people at NASA, when components and systems and everything did not have that immediate need to be updated and built, they were moved on to the next thing, which was the space shuttle program.
I remember kids like me in the 1980s, though I loved the space shuttle, I always remember looking at Saturn V, which was before my time, and thinking, I really wish we had that rocket. And I think there were actually, at the time, 2 still in storage that NASA could have used if they really wanted to, but I think they're on static display now. But yeah, I do remember that. I was like, I love the shuttle, but man, look what we used to do.
Oh, I know. I had the opportunity to see a few space shuttle launches, which were incredible. So I can only imagine what it was like to see a Saturn V rocket launch. I mean, it had to be absolutely mind-boggling, and just, the space shuttle launch, it was like you could just feel your entire body shaking from the sound waves and the noise, and it just had to be so much more intense with the Saturn V.
I'm hoping that SpaceX is successful and able to bring back rockets of that magnitude again so that we can actually see that again. Now, let's rewind long before the Apollo program, before Mercury. Sputnik. The Russians seem to have caught us off guard. What was the reaction within the government to that? Were they really caught off guard, or were they sort of moving in the same direction, but the Russians got there first?
I would say they were moving in the same direction, but the Russians got there first. So the Sputnik was launched during what was called the International Geophysical Year, which was kind of a competition between nations around the world to see who could launch the first artificial satellite. And NASA just... they were having a lot of problems with their rockets. I don't know if you've seen some of the footage of all the exploding early rockets. It's quite devastating, actually, to see all these rockets blowing up. And they had tried to launch a really small satellite. I think it was about the size of a grapefruit, and they just couldn't get it off the ground. And so, the Soviet Union just had those early successes that I think the U.S. public probably felt like we were behind, and that our politicians were slackers, and we had so far to go to try to catch up with the Russians. But there's the old adage about the tortoise and the hare and winning the race. It seemed like NASA in the long run was able to catch up and figure out how to make it all work and take the big prize of getting to the moon.
Now, the Russians also won on getting a man at least into space with Gagarin.
Yes.
That had to spur on the idea that we needed to do this, leading, of course, to Mercury. But what was our first real success with launching rockets in those days?
They launched several rockets. The first one was the Explorer 1, which was the first artificial satellite that was brought up, and that was sent up by rockets. And we learned about the Van Allen belts from that mission. But the first human mission, or that launched successfully, was Alan Shepard, the first Mercury flight, and that was only a suborbital flight that lasted 15 minutes. And it's kind of incredible to think that just 3 weeks after that first successful flight was when President Kennedy issued the challenge of trying to reach the moon. So when he said, let's go to the moon, we had 15 minutes of spaceflight experience. And as I said, it wasn't even an orbital flight, it was a suborbital. So NASA had a long ways to go and a lot of things to do to get to the point where we could even get, I think it was about a month and a half or more until we actually did have an orbital flight. So there was a big challenge and a long road ahead for NASA to try to reach the moon.
After Mercury came Gemini, and that in some ways was sort of a precursor to Apollo, right? That some of the things that would be needed for Apollo were first attempted with Gemini, right?
Right. Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, the rendezvous issue was really a huge unknown of how you get two spacecraft to meet up in space. Flying in space is totally counterintuitive to what we're used to here on Earth. So if you're trying to meet up with another spacecraft, you can't just, step on the pedal and floor it and try to reach the other spacecraft as quickly as possible. Or orbital mechanics just doesn't work that way. So you actually have to slow down to go to a higher orbit, and it's it's pretty counterintuitive. So it took a lot of high-powered math and a lot of computations to get to the point where we could attempt to do that. But yes, Gemini was the first program to fly two spacecraft and try to meet up together and rendezvous and dock and do everything that would be needed to do for the Apollo program of having the command module and the lunar module dock and undock and then there were all the other things like doing a spacewalk in space and maneuvering around in space and getting the feel for what it was going to be like to try to work in space. Now, of course, on the moon you have 1/6 gravity instead of 0 gravity, but they still wanted to be able to figure out how they were going to work inside the spacecraft as well as on the lunar surface as well. So NASA had to do a lot of simulations, and I wrote about simulations in my book a lot, and they had a few different kinds of simulations that would take place on the ground. They had different kinds of trainers that would act like spacecraft that they could fly in, and then they also had trainers that were kind of like cockpit trainers, and those were the most widely used, where they could practice various mission scenarios, and they had mission and control involved, and they could just kind of run through all the possible things that could go wrong and figure out how they were going to be able to fix things on the fly, what things were deemed as necessary, that they had to have problem solver things at their fingertips to be able to fix things quickly, or things that they could work on the fly. So it was the entire sequence of Mercury, Gemini, and then the simulations was really, really pivotal, and really, I think there was a lot of forethought in putting that all together to make sure that they could train both the astronauts and the people in mission control working together and train them sufficiently in order to make going to the moon possible.
Now, what were some of the things that happened that they didn't expect and they didn't train for? Was there anything that stands out there that no one could have predicted?
Yeah, there were some things in some of the early flights of just how the spacecraft would operate and how different things would take place. But there was one thing that I wrote about in my book that is kind of unique, and I kind of an uncovered event that happened, which kind of seems to have been forgotten because it wasn't shared or documented very well. And plus, it seems that just a few people knew about it. So the event occurred during Apollo 11's return to Earth. And, if things had gone bad, it could have ended in disaster. There are two parts to the Apollo spacecraft: the command module, where the astronauts sit, and then the service module, which contains all the fuel and the oxygen tanks. And the two parts are separated before the crew comes back through Earth's atmosphere, because the command module is the only part that has the heat shield to protect the spacecraft. And when the two parts separated, the service module was supposed to move away from the command module and re-enter Earth's atmosphere at a different time. But according to the NASA engineer that I interviewed and documents that he provided, his name is Gary Johnson, at one point the service module came back towards the command module. And, these spacecraft are traveling at tremendous speeds when they're returning from the moon, approximately 25,000 miles per hour. So if the two parts would have collided at those speeds, that would have been catastrophic. This was uncovered several weeks after the crew was safely home. During the crew debrief, the crew mentioned that they had seen the command module fly over. And somebody looked at the transcripts and said, whoa, wait a minute, that wasn't supposed to happen. And then they looked back at the previous Apollo flights that had come back from the moon, Apollo 8 and Apollo 10. And they looked at radar data and they saw that the same thing had happened. So somehow this event never made it into the Apollo 11 mission report, which I think was why it was largely forgotten. I think kind of due to the franticness of the time of needing to move on to the next flight. But I have the documentation from Gary Johnson about it, and he ended up having to make a relatively easy fix to the electronic system to have the thrusters on the service module fire differently in order for it to work the way it was supposed to work. So that was kind of a something that nobody really expected, and it's been an interesting story to have in my book.
Now, wasn't there an airline pilot that actually saw them re-entering and noticed that they seemed to be a little bit too close?
Yeah. So there was I think it was an Australian Airlines, and they knew that they could be in the right position to see the spacecraft returning. And yeah, they noticed that the two spacecraft were, the service module was breaking up because it didn't have a heat shield. And, if any of those small pieces, as it was disintegrating, if that would have hit the command module traveling at those speeds, that would have been catastrophic. So yeah, it's scary to think about, and what Gary Johnson told me is that, if that would have happened, if a disaster would have happened, it's likely they might not have figured out what the problem was. But as it was, they had the astronauts seeing the command module or the service module flying in a way that it wasn't supposed to, and then also they had the radar data as well.
And they were able to fix that. Now, had that happened, had there been a catastrophic event, do you think that Apollo would have survived that? Do you really think that would have been it, and that, enough with the Cold War business, this is just too dangerous, and it might have made for very different history, right?
Right. I agree totally that, especially if we would have had this successful landing on the moon and the live broadcast from the surface of the moon, and then of course the astronauts did a couple of live broadcasts on the way home. It was a very kind of triumphant feeling among everyone in the United States that we had landed on the moon. And if they had been killed on the way home, I think, yes, that would have probably ended the Apollo program right there. I agree, it would have been probably a completely different history than what we know today.
And indeed, we may not have much of a space program today if something had gone catastrophically wrong in any of the Apollos, that at least, on the way to the moon or back. We have to take a break. Today I'm joined by Nancy Atkinson, author of 8 Years to the Moon, The History of the Apollo Missions. And we will be back in a moment. Now, Nancy, with the Apollo program, there was one particularly hair-raising incident, Apollo 13. What went wrong?
Yeah, Apollo 13 was supposed to be the third mission to land humans on the moon, but on the third day of the flight, which ended up being April 13th, 1970, an oxygen tank in the service module exploded. So that was the beginning of what we notoriously like to call the most perilous but eventually triumphant situation ever encountered in human spaceflight. So the explosion ended up crippling the Apollo 13 command module, and of course it endangered the lives of the astronauts. The astronauts on board were Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert. And so during the 4 days that followed of that flight, it was basically nonstop work of people back on the ground, back on Earth, back in Houston, and at contractor companies around the world. These people were working around the clock just to try to figure out how to overcome all of the problems that they were encountering and to try to ensure the astronauts' safe return.
Apparently it got rather cold in there too. As I recall, like 38 degrees Fahrenheit, something like that. So they not only did they have to contend with, a catastrophic event, but also they had to deal with that. They had to deal with lithium hydroxide to, get rid of the carbon dioxide in the air. They had all of these things they had to deal with and come up with workarounds to even get it all to work. And it really is I hate to use the word, but miracle really that they made it back, but they did. Now, what was the effect of that? Did that galvanize the public? Did it galvanize NASA to say, look, we can problem solve in space? Or was that a danger to the remaining missions of Apollo?
A little bit of both, I think. just the kind of tenacity that people had, and the ability that the people at Johnson Space Center showed of overcoming all of these different things that would come up, all of the things to try to fix, to overcome. I think that really showed that NASA had the ability to do things on the fly and to overcome problems. But it was, I think it was almost 2 years, a year and a half until the next flight. There were all sorts of congressional hearings and people figuring out what went wrong, and trying to lay blame on whoever was at fault, I guess. But I think if they hadn't been successful in bringing the crew home, that very likely could have ended the Apollo program as well. So yeah, we might be looking at a very different history if Apollo 13 had turned out differently as well.
Now, in the course of writing your book, I know your foreword is by Russell Schweikert. How many of the astronauts did you talk to? And did you ask anything about what it was like to walk on the moon?
For my book specifically, the only astronaut that I interviewed was Rusty Schweikert. And that was kind of a conscious decision because I did want to make it about the people who hadn't had the chance to tell their stories before. So, as I said, I didn't talk to astronauts specifically for my book, but I have had the chance to talk to several Apollo astronauts. The one that I've talked to the most is actually, besides Rusty Schweikert, is Jim Lovell, who, ironically, he had 2 flights to the moon, but on neither one of them did he end up walking on the moon. Apollo 8 was the first mission that went to the moon, and they just did an orbital mission and orbited the moon for a day and then came back to Earth. And then, of course, Apollo 13, they didn't land on the moon because of the explosion. But other astronauts that I've had the opportunity to talk to are, they just say that it was a life-changing event. A lot of them came home and their lives were different from then on. Buzz Aldrin, I think, is kind of notorious for coming back to Earth and having a really tough time of it. Not really knowing what was next in his life. How can you top walking on the moon? So he had some tough personal issues to work through, and I think some of the other Apollo astronauts did as well. But a lot of them also, it changed their perspective on life on Earth, and changing their mindset of the Apollo program being a competition with the Soviet Union to, hey, why don't we cooperate and we're kind of all in this together. And Rusty Schweikert actually was instrumental in starting an organization of people who had flown in space called the Association of Space Explorers. And that's a group that's still in existence today, and it's anybody who has flown in space can be a member. And they work on providing scholarships to students. They do Earth Day events to try to get people to think about how important our home planet is, our little blue marble out there in the vastness of space that they have seen with their own eyes. So it was definitely a life-changing experience, which I can only imagine what it was like.
Yeah, Apollo 8, speaking of, had one of the most amazing photographs of the entire Apollo program was Earthrise, showing this little Earth, how small it really is over the limb of the moon from lunar orbit. So it just goes to show you just how insignificant this little planet is.
Right. Yeah, that photo of the whole planet Earth, where you can't see any political boundaries, that really was the instigation of the environmental movement in the 1970s and Earth Day. So, which we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of Earth Day coming up here in April. So, the Apollo program was more than just flying in space. It gave us a new perspective on our home world as well.
Do you think that we have this sort of vision again with the activities that are going on now with SpaceX and all these private companies that are launching? Do you think we've finally returned to that sort of attitude again?
I think there's definitely excitement because of, it's not just a government organization that's going, making strides towards new launch vehicles and new destinations and new possibilities in space. So I think there's a lot of excitement about SpaceX and a lot of the other companies as well, Blue Origin, just of the they're new ways of doing things. They're different ways of doing things. SpaceX and Blue Origin are moving faster than I think than NASA has been able to move, at least in the past few years, past few decades, and that gets people excited when you can see the progress that they're making and see one of the most favorite things that I enjoy watching on a SpaceX launch or some of the other companies as well is when they show their engineers cheering and shouting and jumping up and down when they have a successful flight. And that's just so endearing. I mean, that's just shows the emotion and of course shows how hard it is, the work that they're doing. It's difficult. It's hard to fly in space. It's hard to have these spacecraft that have, a million parts to them and have them all work correctly together for a successful flight. So yeah, I think the commercial companies really bring a lot of heart and passion back to spaceflight.
All right, Nancy, we are out of time. Thanks for visiting with us today.
Thanks so much for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
Through the activities of the world's space programs, which continue to push for the continued robotic exploration of the moon, to companies like Blue Origin and SpaceX that want to return humans there, it seems that we are on the cusp to return to the moon in a big way. What awaits us is mostly uncertain, but unlike Mars, it is an object that we have set foot on before, with much success. Perhaps now, however, it's time for a more permanent human presence on and around the moon. Perhaps even a colony is in the not-too-distant future. So you tell me, would you live in a lunar colony? Or would you leave that for some other intrepid pioneers to explore? I think that will be an increasingly relevant question from here on out.
John?
What?
Why have you locked yourself in your office?
Wait, what? I can get myself out of here. Where's my bronze Einstein bust?
It appears the cats and the opossum have figured out how to shut you inside.
The possum? Sprocket, you leave Mr. Pickles and Lady Whiffles out of this. Our quarrel does not need to involve the cats.
They penned a treaty, John.
How would you know? You were involved.
Someone had to do the translation, John.
That's just what I needed. And on that note, we have a very, very special guest coming soon for an in-depth physics discussion. Stay tuned.